So the philosopher's stone was to be found in our own inner transformation. But the third in this lineage that I'm talking about, from Paracelsus to Jung to Albert Hofmann. I came here in 1976. I was a 28-year-old hippie vagabond who'd hitchhiked around the States, hitchhiked to India at one point in search of gurus, and finally ended up wanting to meet Albert Hofmann. I was really interested in the subject of LSD, and particularly interested in a subject, kind of a subsection of LSD, but I was interested in why LSD had changed its effects over the years, or seemingly changed its effects, what that was all about. So I called him up. My friend who I was traveling with had corresponded with him, and he said, well, meet me the next day on the Middle Bridge in Basel. So we went out there and we waited around for Albert, and after about an hour of waiting, we thought, he was an old man. He was like 70 years old, right? But up strode this guy about 55, he looked like about 55 or 50, real healthy and robust, and took charge of the whole thing, of the meeting, and took us and showed us where he had discovered LSD, and how he'd ridden his bicycle from the old Sandoz building before they built the giant skyscraper here. And it was absolutely fabulous, and it shattered all of my preconceptions about of what hip was. I'd been a hippie in the 60s, but here was a man who was always, pretty much an establishment guy. He was a person who was vice president of Sandoz Pharmaceutical Company at that time. It's changed its name now. I don't remember the new one, but I came back from this trip changed in a lot of ways. And the next year I re-enrolled in the university, at University of California, Santa Cruz, in psychology. I left in political science at the end of my third year. So, and that same year, Jonathan Ott was putting on a conference on the book on Eleusis. So I told him, that I'd like to have Hofmann come to Santa Cruz as well. I went and talked to my psychology department, and they didn't like the idea of a conference, but they said a small colloquium would be okay. And now this first slide here is the kind of an odd coincidence. I'm going to be talking about utopias a little bit later. And this was a woodcut that was done here in Basel, so it's kind of a little synchronistic, right? Now, so the next year, let me get rid of the notes. No, I don't want to slideshow it because it's going to just go on automatic. Here we go. So the next year we brought him to Santa Cruz, and my friend Peter Stafford made these posters. Peter Stafford is the author of Psychedelics Encyclopedia, and he printed up these posters and put them up all over Santa Cruz, and this was a free event. So I had a chance to show Hofmann around, picked him up in San Francisco and brought him down to Santa Cruz, and we had a big dinner. We had Allen Ginsberg, Sasha Shulgin was there, Ralph Metzner, Timothy Leary, and Baba Ram Das, or Richard Alpert. And they were all sitting at the table, and Hofmann got up and he said, I am the grandfather of LSD, and you are all my children. And so after dinner, we headed up to the campus, and there's a scene in Marty Lee's book, Acid Dreams, in which Marty has the scene of when I drove up Hoffman up to the campus, and all of a sudden everything was just blocked off. Now, the event was scheduled in an auditorium which held about 550 people, and it was all glass around the outside of it, but like 5,000 people showed up. And so we had to put speakers on the roof, and it was an amazing event. The fire marshals came, and they told me they were going to shut everything down. And that scene is how Acid Dream starts. So from that point, from putting that conference on, we became kind of like a beacon, of putting out this information about psychedelics because of what had happened 10 years earlier in the 60s. And I guess that a lot of that is the subject of discussions here at this conference. Now, you've got to remember that in the 60s, when the psychedelic movement started. Now, you have to make a distinction between the psychedelic movement and the LSD movement, because it really was an LSD movement. Psychedelics were just a catch-all description of a smaller group. Aldous Huxley took his first trip on mescaline. Yes, that's true, and they took psilocybin and so forth. But the reason why the psychedelic movement captured such great force was because it was like one of the great products of the Industrial Revolution. It was mass producible in very small amounts. Its effects were almost no side effects at all versus side effects for mescaline or psilocybin. And so it basically was something that could spread and create a large mass movement. And so in the 60s, it did, and it started as a small group of intellectuals in Los Angeles and New York and London with Aldous Huxley, and it moved to have over 3 million people by the end of the 1960s. But as it picked up steam, you have to also remember, when people here reviled Timothy Leary, for having, ruined psychedelics for scientists. Well, you have to understand the mental set of what people were thinking back then, because in 1963, when Leary first took psychedelics, that was the time when, in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, they were showing these hands moving toward midnight, and at midnight would be the time when the whole world would just blow itself up because we would have the Cuban Missile Crisis, and when people took psychedelics, they would feel like, wow, this was the thing that could maybe save the species. And so, for instance, when Allen Ginsberg, the poet, was first given LSD, he tried to call up Nikita Khrushchev, who was premier of Russia at that time, and Kennedy, and try to put them in touch with each other. Of course, he couldn't get them online, but when he came down, he realized it was a little bit silly, but this was the kind of mentality that people had. They had this idea that if we could affect enough people with LSD, that it would help save the species. And so that was what fueled a lot of it. But at the same time, that created a politicization or a politicalization of it, so that it could not be accepted by the established order. And people pushed very hard. We didn't know very much about those things back then. And so there were a lot of people who shouldn't take LSD who were given LSD. And there are people, even people out here in this audience today, who should not touch LSD, because LSD is a very powerful substance. Some people, by their birth, have pre-existing psychological difficulties that could be triggered off through using LSD. There's no accurate screening mechanism that can rule that out entirely. So it's a dicey thing. Secondly, of course, you don't know what you're getting on the streets these days, and that was the point of why I went and saw Dr. Hoffman, because I was really interested in this idea about why there had been all of these amazing, positive, good things happening in the 60s, and why all of that stuff died out at the beginning of the 70s. And it turned out that the government's war on drugs was really a war on the counterculture and a war on LSD itself, because what it did was, in effect, it didn't stop, cocaine. Cocaine got cheaper and purer. Heroin got cheaper and purer. Marijuana, got stronger. Speed became, everywhere. But LSD became street acid. They had to lower the dose so people wouldn't notice how impure it was. And then at the same time, there were all these myths about how it didn't matter how pure it was. But if you look at it, it's a very small, as Hoffman said, it's a very small amount of LSD that goes into your body. And there's a maximum amount that you can take, that if you take any more, it won't have any effect. And that's only at, around 500 or 600 micrograms. So the receptors can be blocked by these other contaminating compounds and create non-LSD LSD, a dud. And that's what people were getting, but they didn't know it. And there was a reason why it was easy for a while for underground chemists to make LSD, because they could get lysergic acid monohydrate, which was a direct precursor from any chemical supply house. And so they could just turn it into LSD in one step. But when that stuff disappeared, then they had to make it from ergotamine tartrate, which is much harder, and then that started getting the dud LSD out there. So basically, the government was very effective in suppressing the LSD movement, even though what happened was there was actually a change. By the time that my friends and I, had done this conference, it was pretty much all over. There's a very good book about the psychedelic movement called Storming Heaven by Jay Stevens, and that's probably one of the two best books on that you can read on this topic. The other one being the varieties of psychedelic experience. I might explain that in a little while, but Storming Heaven basically stops in 1970. There's a little bit about, people taking some oddball, molecule in 1985, but, it's just a little tagged as like the beat goes on. But what had happened was that from the time of the 60s to the time when we did this conference, this living, breathing, mystical, spiritual movement had been turned into stamp collecting. It was basically all over, and they were studying things in museums. There's actually the most effective thing that psychedelics did was they triggered great ideas in highly creative, self-actualized individuals who were very stable, and produced new memes, new visions. So the 60s were all about producing new memes. The Beatles, John Lennon, putting out these images of love. All you need is love, peace, and these kinds of things. And the Aldous Huxleys. But there was also, of course, research, psychotherapeutic potential of psychedelics in the 60s, which stopped in 1966. It showed that there was therapeutic potential, But when we think about, when some of the scientists say, oh, well, I'd really like to go back to that time, now that those crazy people aren't around anymore, we'll go back to the science phase again. But really the most effective thing about with psychedelics is what it does to people, and what people's, how it changes people's ideas, how it makes them more creative, how they change their behaviors. And the people who had the most effect were the people who were the most creative and could transmit that energy. So LSD isn't only for the sick. It's not only for people with terminal cancer. It's for people who can maybe find an alternative to the things that are going down now in society. And that's now, Aldous Huxley was, an example. Actually, when Maslow, in the previous slide, talked about a self-actualizer, he chose Aldous Huxley as his example. Huxley was a good example of it. Huxley was a conservative guy compared to Timothy Leary, and people, but even Huxley back in the '60s was urging that people take psychedelics. I'll read you a quote from a speech that he gave in Copenhagen shortly before his death in 1963. He said, "How should the psychedelics be administered? Under what conditions? With what kind of preparation and follow-up? These are the questions that must be answered empirically. By large-scale experiment, man's collective mind has a high degree of viscosity and flows from one position to another with a reluctant deliberation of an ebbing tide of sludge. But in a world of explosive population increase, of headlong technological advance, and of militant nationalism, sounds like these days actually a little bit, doesn't it? The time at our disposal is strictly limited. We must discover very soon new energy sources for overcoming our society's psychological inertia, better solvents for liquefying the sludgy stickiness of an anachronistic state of mind. On the verbal level, an education in the nature and limitations, the uses and abuses of language, and the wordless level of education in mental silence and pure receptivity. And finally, through the use of, and they thought it back then, harmless psychedelics, a course of chemically triggered conversion experiences or ecstasies. These, I believe, will provide all the sources of mental energy, all the solvents of conceptual sludge that an individual requires. With their aid, he should be able to adapt himself selectively to his culture, rejecting its evils, stupidities, and irrelevancies, gratefully accepting all of its treasures of accumulated knowledge of rationality, human-heartedness, and practical wisdom. I hope this is not too long, but he, did real long run-on paragraphs here. If the number of such individuals is sufficiently great, if their quality is sufficiently high, they may be able to pass from discriminating acceptance of their culture to discriminating challenge and reform. Is this a hopefully utopian dream? Remember, we started with utopia, right? Experiment could give us the answer, for the dream is pragmatic. The utopian hypothesis can be tested experimentally. And in these oppressive times, a little hope is no unwelcome visitant. So in those next 10 years, after Huxley wrote those words in 1963, the world did take that kind of experiment, and we found some things, we learned a lot of things. One of them is that psychedelics weren't as harmless as we thought they were. Like I said before, some people should never take them. Even people with very sturdy minds can occasionally have a difficult time with them. But we saw in that process also quite a bit of revelation and new ideas. The 60s was a breakthrough time. It was the time of the counterculture. Now, like I said before, the LSD movement wasn't the psychedelic movement, isn't the entheogen movement. LSD is not psychedelics. Psychedelics are not LSD, but this was, what we're talking about here really is LSD and its progression through time. This conference has given you a pretty good education about all of the different aspects of psychedelics. Now, Huxley was afraid that there would be this brave new world and he'd written about in the 1930s. It's a book that actually became required reading for a lot of people in high school. And it was a scary vision. It was a vision not unlike people who live in the U.S. Feel is like happening right now, when I asked Laura Huxley in an interview that I did with her in 1993, I asked her, well, would Aldous, now this is Ireland, by the way, this the Temple of Shiva from Ireland, but Huxley wrote another book called Ireland, which was his antidote to Brave New World. At the Huxley centennial, his 100th birthday, Richard Alpert gave a 3-hour talk on Brave New World or Ireland, which way shall we go? Because in Ireland, Huxley was looking for a way of avoiding the over regimentation, the manipulation of people that something like Brave New World would entail. And so what he did was he took a lot of new ideas, sampled from the scope of memes that was available, and put together, a working hypothesis for how we might live together. But of course, it wasn't a tested hypothesis. And this is the Shiva temple where they would have rituals in the island, which was a mythical island in the South Pacific, which was started by an Indian guru and an English medical doctor named Dr. Roberts, and who I guess that was the guy that the Beatles sang about later on, right? And they came up with this idea of like kind of a combination of the Eastern, Hinduist, Buddhist, Taoist ideas and Western thought. And they would have at these Shiva temples, they would have the rites of initiation into adulthood. Psychedelics were used, but they were used moderately. There was something in the novel called moksha medicine. Moksha means enlightenment, and so it was an enlightenment medicine. It seemed like it was like very much similar to psilocybin mushrooms. But in that book, he hoped to, at least propose how we might go a different route. Now, so in any event, basically I'd like to talk to you straight out. The basic idea that I'm trying to put out here is that we are, just kind of a small family of people who, maybe there was 3, 4, 5 million people who took LSD through, all of time in a world of 7 billion people, of exploding population. And we have to think about how what our best options are. Yeah, we're pursuing the idea of trying to, change society's ideas about psychedelics. We've renamed them entheogens, so that they no longer have the taboo psychedelic word. We try to rehabilitate them by making them only scientists use them, and they only use them for, people who are really, troubled. But in the United States, it hasn't worked very well. They try to do that with, a variety of things, and they just have not had that great of success. Maybe 2 or 3 people have taken drugs in all these years, and they've spent millions of dollars doing that. Now, what I'm saying is that there should be we should explore other options. And this group of people here, represents, subsection of a larger group of people who attend a lot of these kinds of events, who are very interested in psychedelics, and they might want to consider, other kinds of projects where we try to find some place in another part of the world where we don't have to worry about legalities, and do practical experiments there with self-actualized, creative, intelligent people. That's what I call we call that the Island Sanctuary Project. The idea is that there was, besides, Huxley's Island, another book in the 20th century that was a very profound book was Hermann Hesse's Magister Ludi, in which he saw a new Dark Ages. We talk about Paracelsus and how Paracelsus was, a beacon of light in the Dark Ages. Well, what if the world were to go back into a new Dark Ages? What if a lot of the humanitarian values that we hold sacred, went into remission, so to speak, or were, the light was darkened? Where would we go? And that's the kind of things that I think we should start thinking about. We need to think about doing some kind of projects like this, putting our money into, we could start it out by even having, seminars in remote locations like this, where people get together and just, we might even do something more practical than just talking about drugs, because, this isn't all about drugs. This is about experiences, right? And it's about ideas that come out of the experiences. It's about how people's lives are changed. It's about when we did that conference back in 1977, things weren't quite like they are now, where it's, psychedelics are just stamp collecting. So everybody's up here, like they're academics, showing all of their slides and their images of, molecules, or pictures of, shamans or Lucius or whatever. But, the history of LSD didn't start at Lucius. Lucius is an interesting curiosity, but the history of LSD started with Albert Hofmann's discovery. So that's like a misconception, right? The psychedelic movement was not the LSD movement. LSD, not all LSD is equal. Not all LSD is LSD. Some LSD is, and these kinds of errors that we have in thinking are significant. So anyway, that's pretty much what I'm doing, and I'm in kind of a chrysalis state with my Island Foundation. I know people can see what I've been doing at island.org. I also have a blog at bruceeisner.com, where I keep things updated pretty regularly. I'm even covering the conference while I'm here. At this point, what I'd like to do is just open this up for questions. Yeah.
Could you tell me in a little bit more detail what this Island project is? I mean, in terms of what number of people, do you get together physically?
Yeah, we're in the process of planning that right now. And she asked me what kinds of numbers are involved, and what kinds of exact projects and plans are involved in the Psychedelic Sanctuary Project. And the answer to that is that we're currently in the process of doing that right now. We're planning, and we want it to be something that people co-create. You know, I don't want to just lay a plan on you. We're going to lay a basic plan, and let it evolve from people's getting together and having discussions about what to do. Having seminars where they, like for instance, we could visit different parts of the world and then talk about what parts that we might want to, put a human development center like Esalen into. You remember in the 60s, Esalen was a place that you could go in Big Sur. And Big Sur was a remote place in the world back in those days. It was off the beaten track. But now you go to Big Sur, and Big Sur is a whole different story in California. It's, become regimented, and basically you couldn't do the same things that you could back in this. But there are places in the world where there could be new Eselens, new human development centers. And some of the people on the Island Project might want to staff these sorts of centers. Other people might want to come and visit them. It might be, people from my generation, from the boomer generation, who were, been there and done that, and they have, always had a long-term interest in self-actualization and personal growth. And then it also might be young people who have a lot of energy and steam and a lot of utopian visions. By the way, Thomas More, Thomas More came up with the word utopia, which means no place. And also there's another translation of it as being the perfect place. So it's no place in the perfect place. So there is no place that's perfect. And when I'm not looking to create a utopia. Ireland was certainly not a utopia, but we can do better than we've been doing, in getting together and just talking about psychedelics. I mean, if you were put yourself in my position, I mean, I've been writing about these things since 1971, right? I put together 4 or 5 of these conferences. I've listened to all of the lectures. I've got it, but what's the next step? Where do you take it? And that's what I'm putting out there.
You said you've been doing these conferences. You put on 5 of them yourself. Can you compare this conference to any of the conferences in the past? I mean, I'm trying to.
Oh yeah. He's asking me, since I've been at other conferences, if I can compare them to other conferences in the past. Well, this is very large by most conference standards that I've been to, and you could almost see a direct progression from where the conferences went back in 1977 to now. When we brought Hoffman up originally, we were not Europeans, and we didn't know, what to do with German-speaking men. Here they have the interviews are far, you get far more information than you do from when Hoffman got up there and he was first revealing, how he discovered LSD. We thought that Hoffman was against LSD, that he hated, the hippies, and sometimes he's even misinterpreted to the present day that way, because he's trying to be balanced, of course. But when we found out what a great guy he was, that was a big revelation, and it's kind of led from there to here. So there's like kind of now, Hoffman is a way that we can put out good information about these things in the face of a world which has been so bombarded with negative information about psychedelics. It's going to be, one of the reasons why the Sanctuary Project idea sounds good to me is it's going to be very difficult to eradicate the amount of bad PR that psychedelics have been gotten. Every time there's a story about them, there's 100 stories, you know, or Scientologists demonstrating, or, you know, in the United States, they absolutely hate the counterculture. The people, the Republicans in charge of things there, they arrested the guy from Cheech and Chong, right, for putting up a pipe store on the internet, that kind of thing, right?
You know, in the States, though, even the liberal establishment is afraid of us. I find this an embarrassment. I'm sure half the liberal establishment probably sends money to the
Well, there's the,
free America.
I mean, we're not going to be able, I don't think that we're going to be able, our target audience as a marketing person is not to try to reach the masses. I mean, great, we put out some good positive PR here, but that's not, you know, going to do it. What we really need to do is think about how we can get psychedelics into the hands of very highly creative people who can produce, you know, great works and new memes. You know, because memes compete for each other. I don't know if anybody here has read this book, The Meme Machine, by Susan Blackmore, but she explains it very well. You know, memes are all competing for, you know, how they can occupy, you know, some space in our brain, and you know, the best memes win. And the way that we can, you know, produce new memes is by getting together people and creating a meme